Denise Carter had spent 58 years believing she knew exactly who she was. The oldest child, the one who held the family together after her father passed, the one her mother leaned on, the one who planned the funeral, the one who thought she had already learned every hard truth her family had to offer. But on a humid afternoon in Coldwater, Georgia, standing alone in the house her mother had just died in, surrounded by boxes she was supposed to be sorting into keep and donate piles, Denise noticed something off about one of the bedroom walls. A panel that didn't sit quite flush. She almost walked past it. Something made her stop. What she pulled out from behind that wall was a shoebox, taped shut, far heavier than an empty shoebox had any right to be. Inside was a photograph, yellowed and soft at the corners, of a baby boy she had never seen in her life, dressed in a hospital blanket, his tiny face caught mid-cry, and folded beneath the photograph, in her mother's unmistakable handwriting, 6 words that would change everything Denise thought she understood about her own family. My firstborn, forgive me, 1964. Denise Carter was 58 years old. She had always believed she was her mother's firstborn. She was not. Somewhere out there, or maybe nowhere at all anymore, was a brother she never knew existed. A son her mother carried, loved, and was forced to give away before Denise had even been born. And the deeper Denise dug into that secret over the following months, the more she realized her mother hadn't just hidden a child from her family. She had hidden a man who, without either of them ever knowing it, had spent his entire life closer to Denise than she could have ever imagined possible. Close enough to have stood in the same room as her. Close enough that their paths had crossed more than once. And by the time Denise finally understood exactly how close, it would already be too late to do anything about it. To understand what Denise found in that shoebox, you have to understand the woman who hid it. Eleanor May Whitfield was raised in a small farming community an hour outside Macon, Georgia, the kind of place where everybody's business eventually became everybody's business, whether they wanted it to or not. She was the only daughter of Thomas Whitfield, a hard, unbending man who ran his household the way he ran his land, with rules that were not up for discussion and consequences for anyone who tested them. Eleanor died at 81, surrounded by a family who believed they knew her completely, a devoted wife to a husband who passed a decade earlier, a mother of 3, a grandmother who never missed a birthday or a graduation or a single Sunday dinner, the kind of woman whose obituary used words like beloved and steadfast without anyone in the room questioning whether those words told the whole story. But the note in that shoebox raised questions Denise could not ignore. No matter how badly some part of her wanted to fold the photograph back up, put the lid back on the box, and pretend she had never pulled that wall panel loose in the first place. Who was the boy in the photograph? Why had her mother called him her firstborn, when Denise had always believed that title belonged to her and had built 58 years of identity around it? What happened in 1964 that was so painful, so shameful in the eyes of that household, that Eleanor carried it in complete silence for the rest of her life, never telling her husband, never telling her children, never telling a single living soul, until the day she could no longer speak at all, and left the truth behind in a wall instead? Denise was about to find out that some secrets aren't buried to protect the person who keeps them, they're buried to protect everyone else. And uncovering this one would mean confronting not just who her mother really was, but who Denise herself had really been her entire life, without ever knowing it. In 1964, Eleanor May Whitfield was 19 years old, and by every account from the people who remembered her, she was the kind of young woman a small town quietly hoped would stay. She had a singing voice good enough to carry the choir at Coldwater Baptist on her own. She had plans to attend a teacher's college in Macon, the first in her family to go anywhere past high school. She kept a journal hidden under a loose floorboard in her bedroom, the same room Denise would one day stand in, pulling a different secret out of a different wall. Eleanor's father, Thomas Whitfield, was a man who measured his daughter's worth in the same terms he measured his cattle and his crops, by appearance, by reputation, by what the neighbors would say. He loved Eleanor in the only way he knew how, which was tightly and with conditions. That spring, Eleanor fell in love with a young man named Robert Lee Ellison, who everyone called Bobby. Bobby worked alongside his father at a garage on the edge of town, had a laugh that people remembered decades later, and was, in the eyes of Thomas Whitfield, entirely unsuitable. The Ellisons were not Whitfield people. They didn't have land. They didn't have a pew with their name on it. Thomas made his feelings known more than once, loudly enough that half of Coldwater had an opinion about Eleanor and Bobby before the two of them had even had their first real conversation alone. But Eleanor was 19, and in love the way only 19-year-olds can be, certain that her father's disapproval was a wall that time and persistence could eventually wear down. It didn't. By midsummer, Eleanor was pregnant, and in 1964, in a small town like Coldwater, Georgia, that single fact was about to take a sledgehammer to everything Eleanor thought her life was going to be. Her teacher's college, her choir solos, her quiet rebellion of loving a boy her father didn't approve of. Eleanor hadn't told anyone yet. Not her mother, not Bobby. She had maybe 3 weeks left where she alone carried the truth of what was coming. Denise, telling this story now at 58, never knew any of this growing up. To her, Eleanor was simply Mama, a woman who hummed hymns while she hung laundry, who could make a Sunday dinner stretch to feed unexpected guests, who cried at every one of her children's graduations, but never once explained why those tears always seemed to carry something heavier than pride. Denise remembers her mother flinching, just slightly, every single year around the same week in early spring, and never knowing why. She remembers her mother keeping a small wooden box on her dresser that no one was allowed to touch, and being told, simply, "That's not for you," whenever she asked. Denise had always assumed it held old jewelry. She was about to learn it held something else entirely, and that the box she'd grown up ignoring was not the same box she found behind the wall. There's something else Denise remembers now, turning it over in her mind in a way she never had reason to before. When Denise turned 18, the same age her mother had been when she met Bobby Lee Ellison, Eleanor sat her down and told her, almost out of nowhere, that she should never let any man, or any father, or any family tell her who she was allowed to love. At the time, Denise had taken it as ordinary motherly advice, the kind every parent eventually gives a daughter heading off into the world. Looking back on it now, she hears it differently. She hears a woman who had lived through the exact opposite of that advice, who had been told in no uncertain terms who she was allowed to love and who she was not, and who had paid for that lesson with a child she would spend the rest of her life trying not to think about, and somehow never quite managing to forget. Denise also remembers, with new and uncomfortable clarity, the way her mother used to go quiet every February, retreating into herself for a few days each year before snapping back to her usual warmth as if nothing had happened. As a child, Denise simply accepted it as one of her mother's quirks. As an adult sorting through a shoebox hidden behind a wall panel, she finally understood. February the 14th, the day Eleanor gave birth to a son she was allowed to hold for only 11 minutes, every single year, for 58 years, without ever once explaining why that particular week always felt heavier than the rest. Because 3 weeks after Eleanor discovered she was pregnant, her father found out too. And what happened in the Whitfield house over the following 2 days would determine the entire shape of 2 lives that hadn't even been lived yet, Eleanor's and the son she didn't yet know she would have to give away. Thomas Whitfield found out the way most fathers in small towns found out things in 1964, secondhand, through whispers that traveled faster than truth ever could. A neighbor had seen Eleanor sick in the mornings. Another had seen her turn down coffee, then turn pale at the smell of it. By the time Thomas confronted her directly, sitting her down at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening while her mother stood frozen by the stove, he already believed he knew the answer before Eleanor said a single word. She didn't deny it. "Denise, Piecing this together 58 years later, through old letters and the recollections of an aunt who was a teenager at the time, says her mother never denied anything in her life that she knew to be true, even when the truth cost her everything. Eleanor confirmed she was pregnant. She confirmed it was Bobby Lee Ellison's child. And she watched her father's face change in a way she would describe, years later in a single surviving journal entry, as the moment I understood that I had already lost him, even though he was still sitting right in front of me. What followed over the next 2 days was not a conversation. It was a verdict. Thomas Whitfield was not going to allow his daughter to marry into the Ellison family, pregnant or not. He was not going to allow word to spread through Coldwater that his daughter had a child out of wedlock with a garage mechanic's son. And he was absolutely not going to allow that child to carry the Whitfield name or live under his roof as a daily reminder of the one thing he could not control. Eleanor's mother, by every account that survives, pleaded for a gentler path, perhaps a quiet marriage, perhaps sending Eleanor away to relatives until the baby came and then figuring it out from there. Thomas refused. He had already made a call to a minister 2 counties over who, for the right combination of discretion and a modest donation to his church building fund, arranged closed adoptions for young women in exactly Eleanor's situation. It was, in 1964, a more common arrangement than most families ever spoke of out loud. Eleanor was sent to stay with a distant cousin outside of Albany, Georgia, for the final months of her pregnancy, under the cover story that she was helping care for a sick relative. She left Coldwater on a Sunday morning in a car driven by her father, who did not speak to her for the entire 2-hour drive. She would later write that the silence in that car was louder than any argument they'd ever had. For the next several months, Eleanor lived in a town where no one knew her name, attending a church where no one asked questions, growing increasingly aware that the life she had imagined for herself, the teacher's college, the choir solos, the future with Bobby, was no longer a life anyone was going to let her have. She gave birth to a baby boy on February the 14th, 1964. A detail that, when Denise found it decades later, struck her as almost unbearably cruel. That her mother's heart had been broken on Valentine's Day and never once let on, not even with so much as a flinch, when the holiday came up in ordinary family conversation over the decades that followed. Eleanor was allowed to hold her son for 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she wrote it down, the only number in an otherwise nearly wordless journal entry from that day, as if counting the minutes was the only way she had left to hold on to something that was about to be taken from her permanently. She described his weight in her arms. She described the sound he made. And then, 11 minutes later, a woman working with the minister's arrangement came into the room and took him. Eleanor came home 3 weeks later, thinner, quieter, changed in ways her own mother noticed, but never spoke about openly. Thomas told the rest of the family, and eventually the town, that Eleanor had been caring for her cousin through an illness. No one questioned it, or if they did, no one questioned it to her face. Within 8 months, Thomas had arranged Eleanor's marriage to a steady, church-going young man named Richard Carter, Denise's father, a man who, as far as anyone living today can determine, never knew the truth of what happened that winter. Eleanor wore white. She smiled in every photograph from that wedding day, photographs Denise had looked at 100 times throughout her life, without ever once suspecting what lay just beneath the surface of that smile. And somewhere, 2 counties away, a baby boy who would later be named William was being raised by a family who had no idea that the woman who gave him up would spend the next 58 years living less than 90 miles from him, never speaking his name out loud again, not even once, to anyone, for the rest of her life. Denise was born 2 years later. She grew up believing she was her mother's first child, the oldest of 3, a belief Eleanor allowed to stand year after year, decade after decade, all the way to the very end of her life. Eleanor never corrected it. She never even came close to it in conversation, Not during Denise's childhood, not during her own wedding toast at Denise's reception, not even in the final confused, medicated days before she passed, when families often say the things they've spent a lifetime holding back. The question Denise couldn't escape, the moment she found that shoebox, was the one that would drive everything that came next. How do you carry a secret like that for 58 years, in complete and total silence? And why, after an entire lifetime of saying nothing, would your mother finally choose to leave the truth behind in a wall, instead of taking it with her to the grave? For nearly 3 weeks after finding the shoebox, Denise told no one. She kept the photograph and the note in her handbag, taking it out late at night, studying the baby's face, as if it might eventually answer the questions she couldn't stop asking. Who was he? Where was he? Was he even still alive? She found herself staring at strangers in grocery stores who looked to be roughly the right age, wondering, absurdly, if one of them might somehow be him. She didn't sleep well during those 3 weeks. She would lie awake replaying every memory she had of her mother, searching for some sign she had missed, some moment that should have told her there was a hole in the family story no one had ever filled in. Eventually, she drove to Coldwater's small county records office and asked to speak with someone about sealed adoption files from 1964. The clerk on duty, a woman barely out of her 20s, told her gently that records from that era were almost always sealed permanently, especially private adoptions arranged outside the formal court system. Exactly the kind of arrangement Thomas Whitfield had made through his minister contact. Denise left the records office that day feeling like she had hit a wall before she'd even really started. It looked, for a moment, like the trail had already gone cold. It was a retired county sheriff named Daniel Cook who changed that. Denise had known of Daniel for years, the way everyone in a small town knows the man who used to be the law. Daniel had policed Coldwater for almost 30 years and had a memory and a personal filing system that outlasted most official record systems. When Denise explained what she'd found, sliding the photograph and note across his kitchen table, Daniel went quiet for a long moment before he spoke. He recognized the minister's name almost immediately from old church board records he'd helped digitize after retirement. A man who, it turned out, had quietly facilitated more than a dozen similar arrangements throughout the 1960s. Almost all of them kept off formal court dockets, specifically to protect the families involved from exactly the kind of scrutiny Denise was now bringing to it, 60 years later. Word moved slowly through Coldwater the way it always had, even decades after the era, when everyone's business belonged to everyone. Denise hadn't intended to tell anyone outside her immediate family. But small towns have their own gravity, and within a month of her first visit to the records office, an older church member mentioned to Denise's sister that she'd heard Eleanor's girl was asking about old adoption records. Denise never learned exactly how word traveled. She suspected it didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time in her life, she understood, even in a small way, what her mother must have felt every single day of 1964. The particular exposure of having something private become a subject of other people's conversation before you've even decided how you feel about it yourself. Her older brother, when she finally told him what she'd found, accused her of trying to drag their mother's name through the mud for no reason at all. "She's gone, Denise," he told her over the phone, his voice tight in a way she rarely heard from him. Whatever this was, she clearly didn't want us to know. Why can't you just let her keep it? Her sister was more curious, but cautious, worried about what it might mean for the family if word got out around Coldwater, a town that, even now, still talked. Denise understood their hesitation. Some part of her even agreed with it, but a larger part of her couldn't let it go. She told herself it wasn't about exposing her mother or rewriting the story of a woman who could no longer speak for herself. It was about a person, a real, living, breathing person, or at least someone who had once been one, who deserved to know where he came from, the same way Denise now desperately needed to know where she really stood in her own family story. The first real lead came through a local genealogy research group Denise found online. The kind of community built by amateur historians and adoptees searching for their own biological families. People who had spent years learning to navigate exactly the kind of sealed, off-the-books arrangement Eleanor's father had used. Using the minister's name, the rough birth date of February the 14th, 1964, and the county where Eleanor had stayed with her cousin during her pregnancy, a volunteer researcher who had helped crack dozens of similar cases tracked down a closed adoption placement that matched almost perfectly. A baby boy placed with a family in neighboring Houston County under the name William Ellison. Denise's breath caught at the surname, Ellison. The same as Bobby Lee Ellison, the man her mother had loved and lost in 1964. For a moment she wondered if it could possibly be a coincidence. Georgia had no shortage of Ellisons, but something in her gut told her this was not a coincidence at all. It took another week of careful digging, late nights on the phone with Daniel and the genealogy researcher, before Denise understood why. The baby hadn't been placed with strangers at all. He'd been placed through a private arrangement few people outside the immediate families ever knew about, with Bobby Lee Ellison's own older sister, Patricia, and her husband, who had been unable to have children of their own and lived 2 counties over, close enough that, on certain ordinary days growing up, William Ellison and Denise Carter might have shopped at the same grocery store, attended the same county fair, or sat 2 pews apart at a shared regional church revival, without either of them ever knowing the other existed. Denise sat with that information for a long time before she could move forward. The brother she never knew about hadn't been sent away to some distant, unknown family in another state, the way she had quietly assumed. He had been raised practically next door, by his own blood, while her mother carried the secret in silence less than an hour's drive from where he grew up, for the rest of her natural life. There was one false lead before Denise found the full truth. A man in Atlanta, also adopted in 1964, also placed through a Georgia minister with a similar arrangement, who for 2 devastating days Denise believed might be her brother, until genetic testing through a commercial ancestry service ruled him out entirely. She remembers sitting in her car after getting that email, gripping the steering wheel, feeling the disappointment hit her harder than she expected for a man she'd never even met. The hope of finding him had become more real to her than she realized. That disappointment made the real discovery, when it finally came just days later, hit even harder. Because the moment Denise had Patricia's name and the trail that led to William Ellison, she also found something she was not prepared for at all. Something that would change the entire shape of what this search had become. An obituary. And it was entirely, catastrophically wrong, what Denise had assumed this search would end with. Before we go deeper into what she found next, let us know in the comments, where are you watching this from tonight? William Will Ellison had died 8 months before Denise ever opened that shoebox. He passed at 60 years old, after a short illness, in a hospital less than 40 minutes from the house Denise had grown up in. Reading his obituary for the first time, Denise felt something break and rebuild itself inside her chest at the same moment. Grief for a brother she had just learned existed, and grief that she had somehow already missed the chance to ever meet him. He had been a deacon at his church for over 15 years. He had coached youth baseball for over a decade, the kind of man whose former players still posted memories of him in the comments under his obituary. He had one daughter, Angela, and had been preceded in death by his adoptive parents, and, the obituary noted with a tenderness that struck Denise deeply, his beloved Aunt Patricia, who raised him as her own and loved him without condition. Denise read that line over and over. Loved him without condition. It was, in some painful way, the opposite of everything that had been done to Eleanor. And then Denise found the detail that nearly brought her to her knees. Will Ellison's funeral had been held at a church Denise herself had visited dozens of times over the years, for weddings and revivals, Within the wider church community network, Eleanor had remained connected to her entire life. There was no proof Denise had ever physically been in the same room as her brother. But the distance between their two lives, it turned out, had never been more than a matter of a few counties, a few degrees of shared community, and one terrible, permanent silence that neither of them ever had the chance to break. Denise drove out to meet Patricia, now in her mid-80s, still sharp, still living in the same modest house with the wraparound porch where she had raised Will from infancy. Patricia answered the door, already knowing, in some way, why Denise had come. There had been a phone call beforehand, careful and halting on both ends. The conversation that followed, sitting across from each other at Patricia's kitchen table, with coffee going cold between them, became the emotional center of everything Denise had been searching for. Patricia confirmed every piece of the story: the private arrangement through the minister, the decision made within the Ellison family to keep the baby close rather than send him off to strangers, and the fact that Bobby Lee Ellison, Will's biological father, had known exactly where his son was for his entire life, watching him grow up from the careful distance of uncle rather than father, a quiet, lifelong grief Bobby reportedly never spoke about openly until his own death in 1998. Patricia said Bobby came to every one of Will's birthdays, every baseball game he could make it to. He never told Will the truth, honoring an agreement made with Eleanor's family decades earlier, but Patricia always believed Bobby loved that boy more fiercely than most fathers love sons they raise under their own roof every single day. But it was the next detail Patricia shared that became the emotional gut punch of the entire investigation. The moment the story stopped being about records and timelines and became something else entirely. Patricia told Denise that on two separate occasions, decades apart, a woman had come to events tied to their church and community, once at Will's high school graduation reception, held in the fellowship hall and open to the wider community, and once decades later, in a hospital waiting room, on the day Will's daughter Angela was born, and had quietly asked after the Ellison boy, introducing herself only as an old family friend. Patricia hadn't recognized her either time, but she remembered the woman's face, soft and aching with something Patricia couldn't name at the time, something she said she had thought about on and off for years afterward, without ever understanding why it stayed with her. Denise didn't need Patricia to say the name out loud. She already knew. It was her mother. Eleanor had found a way, twice across 58 years, to lay eyes on the son she was forced to give away, standing close enough to watch him laugh, to watch him hold his own newborn daughter, without ever once telling him, or anyone else in that room, who she really was. Patricia gave Denise a phone number before she left that day. Angela's number, Will's only daughter, now living in Macon, working as a pediatric nurse at the very regional hospital where, decades earlier, Denise had once worked briefly as a young nurse's aide before she married and started her own family. The two women's lives, it turned out, had crossed in that building too, separated only by years, walking the same hallways without ever knowing what connected them. Denise sat in her car outside Patricia's house for almost 20 minutes before she could bring herself to dial the number. Denise and Angela met for the first time at a small coffee shop in Macon on a Saturday morning that neither of them would ever forget. Angela arrived already crying, having spent the 3 days since Denise's first phone call going through her father's old belongings, searching for anything that might confirm what this stranger had told her over the phone. She found it in a small tin box Will had kept at the back of his closet for as long as Angela could remember, one he never explained and rarely opened in front of anyone, not even her. Inside was a single photograph of a young woman Angela didn't recognize, soft-eyed, smiling faintly at the camera, with no name written on the back, only a date, the same year as Will's high school graduation. Will, it turned out, had kept a photograph of his birth mother for nearly 40 years, without ever knowing who she truly was to him. Patricia had given it to him as a teenager, telling him only that it had come from a kind lady from the church who used to ask after him, and that she didn't know much more than that herself. Will never pursued it further. He told Angela once, years before he passed, sitting on the porch on a quiet evening, that he sometimes wondered about the woman in the photograph, but figured that whoever she was, she clearly hadn't wanted to be found, and he didn't want to disturb a peace he assumed she had made with leaving him behind. Angela said her father was not a man who carried bitterness about any of it. He spoke of his childhood as a genuinely happy one, raised by an aunt who loved him completely, and a father figure he only later understood was actually his own father in disguise. He never once described himself as someone who had been abandoned. He simply carried a quiet, lifelong curiosity about a woman he never got the chance to know, tucked away in a tin box at the back of a closet. Denise had no way to give her brother the answer he'd spent his life wondering about. That window had closed 8 months before she ever found the shoebox behind the wall panel. But she could give that answer to his daughter. Sitting in that Macon coffee shop, surrounded by the ordinary Saturday morning noise of people getting their coffee and going about their lives with no idea what was unfolding 2 tables over, Denise told Angela everything. About Eleanor, about 1964, about the 11 minutes Eleanor was allowed to hold her son before he was taken from the hospital room. About the 2 quiet visits across 58 years where a grieving mother stood in the same room as her grown child and said nothing at all, choosing silence even when the truth was right there within reach. Angela said the hardest part wasn't even the secret itself. It was understanding, for the first time, that her father had spent his entire life as half of a story neither side ever got to finish. That he had been loved, fiercely and completely, by an aunt and a hidden biological father who chose closeness over honesty, and a birth mother who chose distance over the risk of being known. Angela said the cost of one family's shame in 1964 had rippled forward through 3 generations who never got the chance to choose any of it for themselves, shaping decisions, relationships, and silences none of them could have traced back to their true origin until now. Was justice ever really served in a story like this? Eleanor was not a villain, even though it might be tempting to cast her as one. She was a 19-year-old girl who lost her son the moment her father decided her shame was worse than her grief. A decision made for her, not by her, in a kitchen on a Tuesday evening in 1964. Thomas Whitfield protected a reputation that, in the end, none of his descendants even remember caring about, and that history has not been kind to in hindsight. Bobby Lee Ellison spent his entire life loving his son from the careful distance of uncle, a quiet grief he carried to his own grave in 1998. And Will Ellison, the boy in the photograph, lived a full, happy, genuinely loved life 2 counties away from a truth that could have either healed him or hurt him, and never got the choice either way, because that choice was made for him before he could even speak. Denise says she doesn't know whether her mother regretted leaving that shoebox behind the wall, or whether, in the final months of her life, as her body began to fail her, it became the only way Eleanor knew how to finally tell the truth. Quietly, after it was already too late to change anything, but not too late for someone, somewhere, to finally hear it. Denise still has the shoebox. She didn't throw it away, and she didn't hide it back behind that wall either. It sits on her own dresser now, in the same spot her mother once kept that small wooden box Denise was never allowed to touch as a child. Some days she opens it and looks at the photograph of the brother she met 58 years too late. Most days, she simply lets it sit there, a reminder that some truths take a lifetime to surface, and that the people we think we know completely are very often carrying something we will never fully understand until it's far too late to ask them about it directly. So we want to ask you, if you were in Denise's position, standing in that room with that shoebox in your hands, would you have gone looking for the truth, or would you have let it stay buried behind that wall? What part of this story stayed with you the longest? Was it Eleanor's 11 minutes? Was it the photograph Will kept his whole life without knowing who she really was? Was it the 2 silent visits across 58 years? Tell us in the comments below, and while you're there, tell us where in the world you're watching this from tonight. We read every single one. If this story moved you, this is exactly the kind of hidden family truth we tell every week here on Hidden Yet Heard Tales. Next time, we're uncovering the story of a husband who discovered, 20 years into his marriage, that his wife's entire identity before they met had been a lie. And the reason why will leave you questioning everything you think you know about the people closest to you. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because some stories simply cannot wait. We'll see you in the next one.